And now I'm going to introduce our speakers from today's panel. We have with us Mr. Terry Coonan, Professor of Law and Criminology at Florida State University. Ambassador Lou DeBaca, former diplomat and prosecutor. Ms. Maria Jose Fletcher, co-director and founder of Vida Legal Assistance Incorporated. And Dr. Melissa Torres, assistant professor at Baylor College of Medicine and the research lead for the Global Mental Health Division. And now I'm going to turn it over to Lou DeBaca to get us started today.
Thank you. And thank you to everybody, not only at IAR, but at the COPS office as well, for their support of this project and for bringing us together with practitioners and others from around the country so that we can confront labor trafficking, which we sometimes talk about it as being the hidden crime within the hidden crime. Labor trafficking being something that, while co-equal with sex trafficking in the statute, while both flowing out of the 13th Amendment's guarantee of freedom for everyone, sometimes doesn't show up in the same manner in the statistics in recent years, which is a little strange because 20 years ago when we were working on the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and when we were formulating a lot of the modern techniques, whether it's the victim-centered approach of working jointly between law enforcement and non-governmental organizations, community-based organizations, the workers themselves. But also, as we were looking at this idea of prevention, protection, and prosecution, at that point, the number of labor trafficking cases in the United States was higher than the number of sex trafficking investigations and prosecutions. And of course, one of the things that's good about the increase in the sex trafficking numbers is there's that many more people being identified, that many more people hopefully being helped. But at the same time, we haven't necessarily seen the same intensification of work on labor trafficking. And so today, one of the things that we're going to do is we're going to address this issue, as you saw in the webinar title. We're going to address the issue of kind of the evolution of the work on labor trafficking. What are the trends that are out there? What are the promising practices? We'll also talk a little bit about what are the challenges, and there are challenges. Some of those challenges are structural. Some of those challenges are internal to how we do our own work. Some of those challenges, I think, are going to make us need to look in the mirror and ask some tough questions as to why it is that we don't seem to be identifying labor trafficking cases at the level that we were even a couple of decades ago. For me, as somebody who used to work in the Justice Department and it was the United States government's lead on this issue and the lead diplomat on this issue, I'm very proud of our British colleagues and all the work that they've done in the last 5 years. And yet, I don't think that the United States should lose its lead on addressing labor trafficking, even to one of our closest friends and allies, such as England. And yet that's what's happening to some degree. 74% of the calls that they're getting to their hotline are addressing labor trafficking, where 75% of the calls that we're getting to our hotline in the United States are addressing sex trafficking. For two countries that have almost identical legal systems, have very similar social and cultural systems, and very similar economies, lead economies in the world, both destinations and the strong local economy, something has to be out there that's explaining that dichotomy between us and our British cousins. So one of the things that we'll try to do today is look at that, look at what it is that we need to think about as we look in the mirror and as we strive to do better. But you know, I am, as I was introduced, I am a former diplomat and prosecutor, but I am currently a law professor at the University of Michigan, where I've been for just long enough to unpack one thing on my walls, which you can see behind me, but not too long to start thinking like a law professor. And so what I'll want us to start off with, like we would in class or otherwise, is what is it that we're talking about? And to do that, we're going to draft the other law professor in the room, um, Terry Coonan. Can you walk us through a little bit about what it is that when we're talking about labor trafficking, so that we can all start from the same songbook?
Sure. And Lou, it's really the foundational definition that comes from the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. Again, part of US law since 2000. It defined sex trafficking, forced prostitution, but very importantly, it defined also this for widespread and pervasive kinds of labor trafficking. And interestingly, it's what we call a segmented crime. It's a definition that includes a whole lot of activities, any of which can actually be a part of labor trafficking. It could be recruiting victims, it could be harboring them, transporting them, providing them to someone else who will exploit them, or obtaining, being on the other end of that labor trafficking scheme as well. So very importantly, it looks at the whole host of different kinds of offenses, really, that can all constitute labor trafficking. Anyone engaged in those activities, any single one of them, can actually be prosecuted as a trafficker. And again, there's classic legal terms in terms of involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, different ways that people are exploited. But the basic definition is people who are exploited and who somehow cannot extract themselves from their forced labor situation for whatever reason. And again, this is the definition that most states have adopted. All 50 states also have human trafficking statutes now. Most recently, I think Wyoming in 2013 was the 50th state to introduce this into their state code. So in both federal and in state law, this is the general definition of forced labor that we're looking at.
So Terry, I guess one of the questions that raises to me is, if, this notion of recruiting, harboring, transporting, obtaining people, we had alien smuggling crimes before 2000. We had the Mann Act, which is, taking people across state lines for prostitution. We've got, child protection laws and sex and local sexual offenses and things like that. Why would we need, and what's the advantage of having something that aggregates them? And what makes this crime different from those types of things?
Well, I think, Lou, and what's very, very clear, sex trafficking, of course, has to involve a commercial sex act. So that is the prime definition there. What is impressive to me as an advocate, really, that's worked with labor trafficking victims for close to 20 years now, is just the host of different sectors in the US economy in which we're seeing labor trafficking, whether it is agriculture, hotels, whether it is restaurants. We're seeing it in a host of different agencies and a host of different situations, many of which involve subcontractors. I have to say that this is one of the recurring themes, whether agriculture or hotels or any number of different places. And a lot of that has to do with the modern economy of the United States, that so much of our work is accomplished by subcontractors. It's not necessarily the person working for the Marriott Hotel making the beds. They're not technically employed by Marriott, they're employed by a subcontractor. And in agriculture, the same way. It may not be the person employed by the farmer. No, it's a subcontractor. It's a field boss who oftentimes is the person that we're oftentimes seeing engaging in human trafficking. So it strikes me at what a host of different kinds of sectors of our economy this tends to affect.
Well, and I think that one of the things, of course, that when you see, something that's so multifaceted that shows up in so many parts of the economy, that the need for kind of a holistic new law in the year 2000. And one of the things that came out of a number of cases from the 1990s was the need for not only criminal tools, but for whether it's social services, whether it was new immigration law, really focusing on protection and rehabilitation in a way that wasn't necessarily going to have to be linked directly to prosecution, although closely related, obviously. We're talking about the evolution of human trafficking. So maybe we could start with the evolution of human trafficking and the US response to it through our own experiences in that, because I can tell you from having worked on the TVPA and having worked on implementing that law back in the day, that if it hadn't been for Maria Jose Fletcher and her counterparts at that point at Florida Immigrant Advocacy Center, and the work that they were doing as far as client services and survivor care, we would not have been nearly as attentive to or hopefully effective in what we were doing. So Maria, can you maybe launch us off in a little bit in kind of your own evolution in this, and to the degree that you think that it might be indicative of how the field has evolved as well? And you're muted, Maria Jose.
So good afternoon or good morning, for depending on where you are in the country right now. And I just wanted to add something to what you and Terry were talking, and I think also shows the evolution of the laws to address human trafficking, is that concept of someone being forced, right? So all the laws that we had in the past required a show was physical force or the threat of physical force. And the manifestation of human trafficking or slavery-like conditions, or the exploitation that gets to the point of being considered forced labor, doesn't require the use of force or the threat of force. It's the tools utilized by the traffickers that are very similar to the tools that are used by an abuser in a domestic violence situation, in a case where you have children being abused by a parent of a legal guardian. And so you see that the play of the power and control, and how we manipulate the person to do something that we want them to do, without them realizing that they could perhaps get out. So is this the chains on the mind, right, that we talked about? And I think this concept, even though we've been talking about it since the early 2000s with the new law, the VTPA, we are still struggling as service providers, investigators, prosecutors, with that concept of the uniqueness of the abusive behavior of the trafficker on the mind, the act on the mind. And it's a very subjective analysis that has to be made. So we took, and I wanted to now jump on the history of the work, my work personally. It's connected to domestic violence and sexual violence. At the time in the late 90s, we had legislation addressing immigrant protections within the immigration law for survivors of domestic violence and sexual violence. And during that time, we received referrals from the Department of Justice, Department of Labor, our local state prosecutors that didn't fit, these cases didn't fit the protections already existing for immigrant victims of domestic violence and sexual violence. And so we had to be very creative, and we talked with someone like Lou. What can we do to provide not only an avenue for these individuals to access justice for the victims, the workers that were being exploited, but also to provide protections within the immigration law to remain in the country legally. Because what we were seeing in the past were hundreds of victims that provided testimony, provided assistance to law enforcement, and then because of the laws of the country were such, they were removed to their countries of origin. So we went with working with the community that was already serving immigrant survivors of other crimes, such as intrafamily violence or sexual violence, to incorporate some of the lessons of the field into the working with survivors of trafficking. And so it's a community that comes forward informally, and then through the legislation formally. And so we have we have been, in a way, forced to work with law enforcement. And Terry can talk more about that too, on how immigration attorneys not traditionally working with ICE, with immigration and customs enforcement on a regular basis, sitting down and around the table and talking about a case and planning what we're going to do to bring this case to fruition. And so that's, I think, my experience as an attorney, as a defender of immigrants, moving into this work and working in collaboration with governmental and non-governmental stakeholders.
Well, Terry, I think you had a little bit different of a way into working on human trafficking, but I think very much centered in the Florida experience. Can you tell us a little bit about your evolution in the field and how
Sure.
you?
Well, I'm happy to follow Maria Jose because I've been following her for 20 years now. It was through Maria Jose that myself and our Human Rights Center here at Florida State University was brought into that. It was a sex trafficking case, the Cadena case, back again around 2000 or so, where we were asked to actually help document what could those survivors tell us about what they needed. So again, that was my introduction here in Florida. Our Human Rights Center works with survivors of both sex and labor trafficking, and we've done that for several decades now. When I think of my own learning curve, though, Lou, a lot of it has to do with my background. Maria Jose's, especially in domestic violence, but in sort of the first older period of my life, I was studying to be a Catholic priest. Was in the seminary, and as part of that, spent several years in Santiago, Chile, and this was at the time of the Pinochet dictatorship there. And my work ended up not being traditional sort of church work, but rather working with survivors of torture. A lot of them very young survivors, my age as well. And what I probably could not have guessed then was that what I was seeing on a daily basis was trauma, the trauma of torture survivors. What I couldn't have known is that, sadly, that was probably good preparation to now work with survivors of human trafficking. That what we're seeing, and I think what we as a field have learned, is that that kind of trauma is what we're really having to work with. So, I mean, was my learning curve, but really that was our learning curve as a field as well, that we're having to deal with massive amounts of trauma. The other thing, and Maria Jose alluded to it, that, you know, as one who then studied law and especially worked in the area as an immigration lawyer, we still do a great deal of pro bono immigration law here at our center. But I could not have guessed that I would be working closely with ICE agents and FBI agents, federal law enforcement. Early on, I thought, they're the other side. They're the people I'll be litigating against. But the collaborative movement, and Lou, you've been, of course, one of the pilots of that, this idea that service providers and law enforcement and prosecutors have to work closely together if we're to get at this problem at all. That law enforcement can't care for victims, but service providers, we actually can't put traffickers away either. So that collaborative movement is, I think, the other part of my own learning curve, but that of our sort of whole anti-trafficking field here in the United States as well.
Well, and to keep our focus on the academic, Dr. Torres, you're our non-Floridian on the conversation. I don't know if I'm honorary from all the time that I spent there doing those cases. Just as human and hot, South Texas. So, Melissa, can you walk us through a little bit about how you came to understand what this thing, human trafficking, was, and how you came to continue to work in the field?
Yeah, it's well, hello everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. It's the language of how I came to understand is very tricky. But I started off for years, my background is in HIV, and I was a tester and counselor, and so working in outreach in HIV for probably about 4 years at this point when I was introduced. And as one of the only Spanish speakers, you know, I was tasked with picking up Hispanic numbers. So doing outreach in a lot of the immigrant enclaves, barrios, you know, all those spaces. and came across a group that was very interesting. Over the span of about a month and a half at this one strip club, I was testing women, and most of them were from the same town in Mexico, had the same boyfriend, lived in the same apartment complex. One even showed me how they were brought to the club. They didn't go to work on their own and come in through the front door. They had someone bringing them through the back door and through this cut gate, like a hole in the back of the club. And so, at work, we were asked to bring odd cases forward to start learning about trends and where we should be targeting outreach, and what harm reduction we needed to do. And so I had mentioned this, and about a week later, my boss asked me, had you heard of human trafficking before? This was 2006. And I'm from the border and thought smuggling, that's the language I had heard. And he said, no, it's actually, when people force someone to sell sex. And so this was right at the time I started my grad school, working on my master's. And I had to then do an internship. And so because I was a certified tester, they placed me to do my internship at an HIV clinic. And it just so happened that they had what was forming to be a transgender organization. At the time, it was more like a support group. And one of the founders came to me and said, hey, we do a lot of outreach to transgender sex workers. There's a huge group. There's like a whole neighborhood where there's a lot of immigrant Latinas. We don't speak Spanish. They won't speak to us, but they need to get tested. Would you come with us? So I did. And that was actually the group that really taught me, this is how you can tell what's going on. This is who's a sex worker. This is how you can tell who's doing it on their own will. This is how you can tell who's, being forced to do it. This is how you can tell that, the girls can't really talk, and just took me to all these different spaces, even showed me like, I don't know how to say it in English, propaganda, like posters on the side of cantinas, and how they advertise, and this is what you look for, and this is how they hide it, and all this kind of stuff. So I really got to know a lot of the girls in these spaces, and got to see not only the differences, but the hierarchy. And to tell you the truth, at this time, through my own learning of what trafficking was, and then my own unlearning, I realized how much, especially with language and learning it mostly in Spanish, how much culturally was really misunderstood in the US about trafficking and exploitation, more specifically with the immigrant and Latino population. So then when I went on for my PhD, I started researching it. I had an internship in a policy think tank on trafficking legislation. So then I learned how the laws were being done, and I realized who wasn't at the table when those laws were being made, and how many people who were making the laws really misunderstood a lot of, the language they were using wasn't the language or the ways it was happening. And then I did my dissertation, which is when I met you, Lou, where I was interviewing identified women who had been trafficked in cantinas. And I also interviewed their investigators and attorneys. And then I also interviewed the men who were purchasing sex in those spaces. And so getting all those different perspectives of all the players in that, in that space. And to be honest, this is a different and unique space because there's a lot of barriers that are removed within these closed social networks. But it really made me realize, one, how much is misunderstood within my own culture, how much is then misunderstood from those outside of that culture who are imposing a lot of these laws and definitions and understandings, and then who's falling in between the gaps. So, and I have to say, I've kind of seen that same evolution, for the years that I've continued to work in trafficking and exploitation.
I think that the understanding and misunderstandings, slosh around, and not everybody's at the same place in their learning journey. That's one of the things I think has been challenging for me over the years, is that, I end up taking this learning journey, and so then I end up thinking, kind of, sex trafficking versus labor trafficking, starting to see that where the differences are or where the differences aren't, et cetera. But then you get somebody new who's coming into the field for the first time, and their focus might be on one very specific aspect of trafficking. If they're working with, domestic servants from Africa who are enslaved by diplomats, that's the kind of the world of trafficking that they see. If they're focused on, white American children, cisgendered females who are, being put into sex trafficking over the internet, that's what they think trafficking ends up being. And I think everybody ends up having to make that journey. Let's talk a little bit about those kind of misconceptions and the blind spots that we all have on that journey. And again, we're concentrating on labor trafficking, but I think one of the things that all of you who are watching have seen from all of us is that we worked on, both sex and labor trafficking simultaneously. The lines between, even in the Cadena case that Terry mentioned that Maria Jose and I worked on, some of those women were, working, cooking and cleaning and doing a lot of things that, were not sex. And some of the younger girls, if the older women were able to protect them from having to be with clients, they were still being enslaved, whether it was as for concubinage, forced, boyfriend, girlfriend relationships with the guards or what have you. So this notion that this is sex trafficking, this is labor trafficking, I think especially with the Cadena cases that Dr. Torres and I had some experience with. So that's one blind spot. Maria Jose, can you, maybe identify some other blind spots or assumptions that we maybe make that get in our own way when we're looking at these cases?
Yeah, I'm just gonna apologize. Well, I'm not gonna apologize because it's right now we have big storm here in my area in Miami, Florida. So you may hear thunder. I think that we were, in a sense, very privileged that we were able to encounter the whole variety. I mean, it's very sad that people have been placed in these situations, but for us, the learning experience came with each case. And I think we didn't have any preconceptions. We were open to learning from the individual, from the person, the worker, the person that will come to our office and said, help me get my salary that hasn't been paid, or help me free my younger sister that is stuck in this place and cannot leave. And so little by little, we started having these conversations and learning about, I think the premise is that people needed to survive, people needed to make a living, people needed to support their family members back home. And so if we look at them and we really see them as workers, and that this is an issue of getting a salary and performing a service, work, anything labor, those distinctions get very diluted. There are many women that we encounter were forced into the sex industry. It was never something that they got into by design because they wanted to do it. And then they were forced into it, right? And so our response may have been one, and this has happened throughout the years, that the response may be, we are gonna use what we have, the tools that we have to help them when we work with women that somehow tell you that they come into the industry voluntarily and then later on get forced into doing something else that they didn't want to, or they're not getting paid, or there's some situation that now is no longer what the language that we used before, sex work, and it becomes sex trafficking. And so there's no way for us to come in and present our preconceptions and then just be okay with making the mistake. And one of the big mistakes that we've made in the past were providing counseling to someone that never wanted to do it, in trying to help her. And the language used in the past was get her out of the life, right? That was never a life that this person wanted to live or lead. And so I think the message for all of us is, as an investigator, as a prosecutor, as a victim witness coordinator, or anyone, a service provider, is to come in with a really open mind to hear the story and look for, we have a definition that we need to go by in order to access what. And so if I'm a prosecutor, I'm going to listen to the story looking for evidence. Can I charge this crime, right, to the perpetrator? But then can I also, what happened to this victim? Can I help this person? What can I do? And that those two should not be dependent on each other. I mean, the law, and I go back to Melissa, and the laws that were passed and that we're still working on refining connected the assistance of immigrants with the prosecution of the traffickers, at least with the opportunity for them to stay in this country legally if they collaborated with law enforcement. And that has, again, is part of this exercise that we perform every time we encounter a new client. And I think something that also, talking about these misconceptions or preconceptions, is the sense that the community doesn't know what's happening. And the community knows, but that's survival. It's not just survival for the particular worker, but it's survival for the community. So how we're going to approach coming into the community and saying, we are here to help. And I remember in the past going in with someone like Lou or someone like Alex Rivas from the FBI and talking to the community and saying, well, the law says that if you're working in this country, regardless of your immigration status, you are deserving and entitled to your pay. And so it wasn't me, the service provider. It was someone from FBI, someone from the Department of Labor, someone from the Department of Justice. All of that was necessary in order to develop the trust, right? But I think that has something that, and we'll talk later about what we need to do to get more labor cases prosecuted or investigated, or getting people closer to justice, to fair wages. I mean, there's so much. We talk about human trafficking in isolation, or we talk about human trafficking with a specific agenda. So depending what I am and what I'm funded to do. And so that's another subject that comes in the trend, is when we started, there was no specific funding to do anything related to trafficking. We just did what we needed to do to help. And even maybe within the government agencies, there was not even specific funding assigned for their officers to work in these cases. So now it's a two-way. It's like the benefit of having the funding to do this work, but then creating these boxes. And so we created the boxes more and more, because if I get funded to do just minor sex trafficking, I'm going to be proficient on that only. And the money that comes is going to dictate how I do it. And I will not be able to help another person, or maybe another person with a different variety of how the person was recruited or what they were asked to perform. So we're learning, we continue to learn so many years. And I can give you examples of the cross cases where the worker comes to you, could be a domestic worker, could be someone working in construction, could be a female agricultural worker. And we think, oh, this is purely labor trafficking, no element of sexual violence. And then we find out that we're wrong. And so again, how do we provide the service? How do we investigate that case? What charges we can bring forward? That person is going to give you all of that, all that evidence that you need.
It's interesting because I think as you say this, the idea of having to really meet the survivor where they are rather than where our silo or our organizational structure ends up being. And hopefully then that means changing our structures so that they're a little bit more multifaceted. One thing that you said, Maria Jose, that I've heard from plenty of people in the past, and often it was a reason to not do sex trafficking cases, which was, oh, well, she was a prostitute back in, Thailand, Korea, whatever, as though that had then waived her right to ever, be free in her choices. Almost nowhere have I heard somebody say, oh, well, he picked fruit in Guatemala, or he was a construction worker in Africa. And I guess that to me, and Terry, if you can maybe pick this up, again, this kind of, are we making assumptions, whether not just gendered assumptions like that, but assumptions about, that sex trafficking is something that you are forced into, whereas labor trafficking is maybe something that you are voluntarily entered into the labor relationship, and now you're trapped through some type of coercive force. As with all this, the truth is probably somewhere more in the middle. But what are some of the misconceptions that you've seen that can help us understand that fissure?
Lou, I think the basic misconception, I've seen this repeatedly, and it's what we call, there's interesting journals in the legal literature about this, but looking at what we call the iconic victim, this sort of misconception about what does a victim truly look like. Now, when a lot of the trainings I do with law enforcement, we'll always start the training by asking them, how many of you have seen the movie Missing and or Taken, and they'll all raise their hands. They've all seen the movie Taken. And I have to tell them, forget everything that you learned from Liam Neeson about what human trafficking is or who victims are. The danger isn't really sending our daughters to France for the summer. It's a lot closer to home. But it's that misconception. And in legal literature, they talk about it as the iconic victim. And a lot of times that's a public misconception. It can be in the minds of law enforcement in terms of what does a victim, an actual victim, look like? And the iconic victim idea is that, well, it's always a young woman or a child. They're always grateful to be rescued. They're always willing witnesses in a case, and they're always just really, really happy to work with law enforcement and prosecutors. And I don't think I've ever met a victim that actually fits that description. That, no, when you see the complex situations that you and Maria Jose have mentioned, yeah, it doesn't come down to that. That's especially true in labor trafficking. It's true in sex trafficking, but especially in labor trafficking, it's one of the things that I think we have to work with. What are the sort of popular misconceptions that we have about what labor trafficking victims are, but also what can we expect when we work with them? The flip side of that, and I've also seen this, is in working with victims who don't see themselves as victims. And again, they may be doing something similar to what they did in their home country. They may have experienced a lot of marginalization in their home country, and they experience it here. One case that I think of, and this was years back, federal law enforcement asked me to come down to South Florida to do some interviews in Spanish with a number of men that had been in a labor trafficking exploitation. And I was interviewing this one relatively young man from Mexico and listening to his story. And he was telling me how he had been brought here. He owed $2,000 for his smuggling fee, and that he was having to pay it off, but that every week another $100 got added to it, and how he was also being charged for sleeping on a concrete floor. They charged him for rice and beans twice a day. They charged him for the tools. They charged him for the ride out to the field. He said, we got waking up every morning at like 4 a.m. This guy comes in and kicks us awake with his steel-tip boots, and he had welts and bruises all over his face. And I remember saying to him, and it was in Spanish, I said, oh, that sounds terrible. I mean, that sounds like human trafficking. And he looked at me, he said, told me in Spanish that, well, this isn't human trafficking. He says, eso fue trabajo de mierda. This was just a really shitty job. And I had to think for a minute. It's like, okay, we're not going to use the language of human trafficking, and we're also not going to use the word victim. And I've learned that when I work with male survivors, never talk about human trafficking, never talk about you being a victim. Instead, we talk about, this person stole from you, all right? You earned money that he took from you. Let's talk about it in a way that you understand it. But it was interesting to me that he could not apply the concept of victim to himself. And maybe that's most of us who are males. We don't think of ourselves as victims. No, we're out there to actually change the world. But it struck me that this is also part of that sort of iconic notion that the public has it, maybe some law enforcement have it, but many of our survivors have it too, that they don't necessarily know their rights, and that especially in labor trafficking, that we have to be, I think, very, very sensitive, but also relating to them that you have rights. You have rights here in the United States. You may not be documented, but they actually can't steal from you, like Maria Jose said. And we have to work constantly with the stereotypes, those misconceptions. And it's a big part of, I think, what gets in the way of labor trafficking when you have a male who is presumed to be in control or able to escape. And again, what I learned myself is just that the impact that trauma can have on people, that males can suffer trauma just like anyone else can, and that we have to account for that as well.
It's interesting, Terry, the idea of the male victim coming from the torture areas. You'll end up having, asylees and folks who've come out of a torture situation. They may have been, a colonel in the security forces. It doesn't mean that they weren't traumatized by the torture that they went through. And I think that that's one of the things that we see with these male victims. One practice note, and I think everybody needs to do their investigating and think about the questions they want to ask, on their own circumstance. But one thing that I realized with some of these macho young men was that opening and spending the first few hours maybe of the interview on what they saw happen to other people. Maybe even if it was, did you ever stand up for, if once you're cross-referencing your entire case, and maybe that there was a younger person who ended up getting hurt, and it's like, well, what did you do to, help, Angelo out when, that thing happened to him, and how did what happened to Angelo make you feel about your circumstance? And were you concerned that something might happen to you? And you can actually get almost basically everything you need to make a determination that this person is a victim of severe form of trafficking for the purposes of certification, for the purposes of a continued presence or T visa, even for a criminal complaint or an indictment, without ever having to ask them straight out, were you afraid or are you a victim? And I think especially the "are you a victim," in the American legal system, we make our decisions about whether something happened based on whether or not there's evidence that satisfies the elements of the crime. We don't make our decisions based on whether or not the victim of that crime was able to somehow use the magic legal word in describing what happened to them. And I think that's one of the things that we see over and over in labor trafficking cases, is if they don't come in with the right word, if they come in and say, he keeps taking our money, or I keep having to sleep on the floor and he kicks me all the time and I can't leave, we stop when we at the, oh, well, this must just be a wage theft type of situation. Melissa, is anything better in the social sciences? I mean, one of the things about having, a PhD who, sits at the intersection of social work and public health and the things that you've specialized in, I feel like, at least my dream is that all of us that have done stuff in law enforcement can learn that there is greener grass on the other side of the fence, as far as some of the tools or some of the ways that you all look at misconceptions or assumptions when you're even starting to go out and plan an interview or plan an intervention. Are there things that we should be thinking about and maybe trying to bring in from the social sciences, Dr. Torres?
I mean, misconceptions go across the board. Terry says that the language in your field is iconic victim, and we have the perfect victim as well. in our spaces. And as a note, I taught a trafficking class at the University of Houston that I had started when I was working on my PhD. And on the first day, I would ask everyone, what made you want to take this class? And the first few years, it started dwindling, but the first few years, there was several who, I saw the movie Taken, and I was like, you all are going to probably hate my class. Because that's not how it happens. But there was that understanding, like, oh my gosh. And something also that was very telling to me, and every year after year when I would teach it, on one day I would teach, first day was policy, the second day was labor, third day was sex. And I always wish I had a camera to capture the discussion after labor and then discussion right before sex, that transition. Because talking about labor was like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. This is too big. I didn't know that the shrimp I ate, could have been from slave labor. I thought just because something was American made, it meant that there was, nothing wrong in the supply chain. And then when we transitioned to sex, it was like, no, that's bad. And I don't have a hand in that. So I'm fine. These people are monsters. They're the horrible ones. And we just automatically just started othering and moralizing the situation. And I always hear these statistics that have now, been proven to not be scientifically based, but, the lifespan of the age into entering into prostitution is like 12, which isn't, also isn't scientifically based, but the mortality rate is at about 25 years. I was lucky enough to spend time with a mining community in Bolivia, learning from them. And yeah, the age that they enter into that is like 9, and the mortality rate for them is 30. Any kind of labor that's exploiting you and using your body in a sense that you're not trying, you're not contributing to, and is going against your abilities, is going to have an impact on your health and your mortality. And that's something that we really try to push in the social services and public health aspect. I think the benefit of having a public health approach, and you all have mentioned, again, you all worked on the development of the TVPA. But obviously, it started off very prosecution focused because it is a criminal code. It is going against the criminals in this case. But then when you tie in services to that, you need to have a different lens. It can't just be focused on prosecution. Prosecution is, again, focused on a victim. So what makes them the victim? I need them to show their victimhood and how they became victimized in the situation. Whereas in public health and social services, we're trying, the term is survivor. We're trying to help them survive and rehabilitate. And, what are the next steps to get past this situation or to deal with it, or even just, basic harm reduction if they're not leaving the situation or able to leave the situation. So, there's these conflicting lenses of needing to prove victimhood while getting past that point. And then there's that person at that nexus that's dealing with that, I think we need to expand from it. I think it really is about meeting them where they are. Do they even want to leave the situation? And if not, do we really think that that's all that makes them, deserving of any kind of services or help, if they're part of that process? And also this moralizing of how anything having to do with sex by force is, so much worse than anything that we're forced to do with our bodies, by force or coercion. Yeah, so I think there's several misconceptions across the board, and it goes across fields. I see it within myself, and as many groups and trainings and conferences and meetings that I've attended where we're, trying to better the narrative and be more inclusive, I still see it always driving towards sex. And even within that space, just sex towards children, sex trafficking of children. And it keeps just getting narrow and narrow without realizing that scientifically we've seen labor trafficking is far more prevalent across the globe. This is happening in different, in various ways every day. All these people are getting ignored because we don't moralize that. We think labor is something in this society that everyone has to do. You know, you contribute and you're supposed to contribute. And if not, you're not a worthy member of society. You're not a functioning member of society and aren't deserving of things that you need to survive. So I think that's a lot of the issue. And then, you know, people ask me, how did I get to interview the guys in my dissertation, the guys that were going to Campinas? And the truth is, I was already working with them on labor exploitation, you know, and because they were a vulnerable population, you know, undocumented immigrants in particular in this case, undocumented immigrants who didn't have a large support network, were needing work. And then some, you know, were trafficked for sex, and some were trafficked for labor. Some were trafficked for drugs, you know, which would be like illicit labor. It's not like I'm more susceptible to be sex trafficking and someone else is more susceptible to be labor trafficking. Exploitation is out there, and if someone's going to exploit you, they're going to exploit you however they can. You know, I mean, I've seen sex traffickers get involved in selling people to work in construction or agriculture. You know, same thing of people, traffickers in agriculture or disaster response, then bringing women over, you know, in sex trafficking cases for the men that are there working. If however people can exploit you to profit, they're going to do it. And so this constant silo and focusing on sex as like the worst thing that could happen to someone is really one of the main reasons that we're missing so many more victims and so much more of learning how exploitation is actually happening. And because we're not focusing on that basis. Like I said, I looked at a vulnerable community and saw how they were trafficked and exploited in different ways. I wasn't looking specifically for that type of exploitation in that case. And that's where I got to see all the different ways that, you know, they were tied into each other.
It's interesting because, again, and not trying to elevate the impact of there being sexual abuse as opposed to other types of abuse. But one of the things that I think we've seen globally with a number of our counterparts in other countries is being surprised at the level of sexual abuse of male labor trafficking victims. The more isolated and more under control the male labor trafficking victim is, the more likely there is to be sexual abuse, and maybe even long-term endemic sexual abuse. So, you know, the fishermen on the long haul boats that are catching the tuna fish that we all consume, and you know, the men in mining camps and things like that. You know, that's not something that they're going to necessarily lead with when they're telling us about what happened to them. And yet it ends up being one of the aspects of control, violence, shame, you know, etc. I definitely feel like it's, you know, a situation where when somebody has that much control over another person, eventually they will manifest that control through some sort of sexual violence. Does that make it sex trafficking, or does that, as opposed to labor trafficking? Under the law, no. Does that then raise new things that we need to know as far as our psychosocial response, as far as meeting that person's needs? Certainly. And so I think that's something that we need to, you know, not, you know, my practice note for everybody in the call is not to immediately, you know, try to go and you know, see if the construction workers were sexually abused, and then not take the case unless that happened, but rather be open to the notion that that might have happened, and it might come out slowly, and it might come out during trial, and it might come out long after trial, or it might not ever come out to you. It might come out to somebody else. You know, I think it's being there and meeting them more kind of where they are. So speaking of the construction workers, there was, you know, the case up in Minneapolis a couple of years ago where the boss was going to the hospital to try to keep the guys from telling anything to the doctors and folks because he didn't want ICE to find out about. I think he was more concerned about them being undocumented than he was concerned about the fact that he was enslaving them. But you know, the doctors there and we've seen this in other situations, had seen enough guys coming through that they were starting to say, well, we keep seeing, these immigrant workers coming in with these horrible injuries. And there's usually somebody there, obviously, there to keep them from talking. And some of the training around sex trafficking, I think, is starting to rub off public health. So I'm going to set up an issue, and then maybe if we could start, Maria Jose, if you could walk us through some of the case examples. But I find it interesting that, as we're working on this and as we're trying to be open and holistic, we do start to see the fact of children in labor. Maybe that's a misconception as well. When we think about labor, and we've talked about labor for the last 45 minutes, it could be that the vision that we have is a domestic servant and thinking that that's probably female. If we might think about the farm worker, and we probably think that that's a male, even though a lot of farm workers are female. We might be thinking about construction workers. And when we have that image in our mind, we're probably not thinking about children. If we talk about children in trafficking, we probably think about that minor child sex trafficking victim. So, Melissa, you've been working on developing tools to identify labor trafficking with children. Terry, you've been working on legislation in Florida as well as doing cases. And Maria Jose, I know that you've had some child cases that may even currently have some child cases. Without breaching any confidences, Maria Jose, could you maybe get us started? Tell us a little bit about the cases you've seen.
Yeah, I think that for everyone's benefit and also the benefit of where we're going with what we're doing for so long and who do we want to help, I think that we have to really recognize what Melissa was mentioning about this concept in our culture in the United States and in developed countries where, the person has to produce, the person has to be working, even if you are in high school. It would be abnormal that a child is not at the same time working, right? That whether it's working at McDonald's or at Taco Bell or babysitting, cutting grass, whatever it is. So we normalize a behavior that comes with our history and the way that we see how people have to evolve a work ethic, right? And in other cases, is I'm talking more like middle class, but then we talk about people that actually don't have the income. The parents are working 2-3 jobs, and so the child needs to go out there and bring more money home. And I'm talking about U.S. citizens. I'm not even mentioning immigrant children. The population that I serve is immigrants, but we have had cases of labor trafficking involving young U.S. citizens that had been selling magazines door to door, selling candy door to door. And these are U.S. citizens that speak English. But there's a need there, right? There's a vulnerability, age, economic situation, etc. I had someone come to my door recently, a young boy. Because of COVID, I'm not opening the door. I have 2 crazy dogs that make a lot of noise. So I just opened the window. He had a mask, young African-American boy, maybe 15, 16, and he's selling candy. And we haven't seen that in a while, not in my neighborhood. And there's no one around, no car, nothing. It's just him walking in the heat here. And I'm like, start talking. So, I can fall into the, like Melissa saying, everything that I'm going to see is going to be trafficking. But I asked him, how did you make it here? Is someone looking for, waiting for you? And he said, oh yeah, they're waiting 2 blocks away. I didn't see any other children. It was just him. Extremely concerning. And then we know that these cases happen in the United States. When we look at children coming from other countries, especially Central America, Mexico, the Caribbean, again, a child, 13-year-old, a 12-year-old, either if you're a female, you're ready to go out there and get a man that is going to support you. You're going to have children and you're going to be a house woman, person, wife, right? And if you're a man, if you're a boy, you're supposed 14, 15, 13, you're supposed to go out there and help the family and find a job. And so they come to the United States and they're in that situation. We encounter someone recently and we're working with the case that, and I'm disguising it. The case is sent to us because of violence against the child by the father, biological father. So I can do a U visa. There's a report to the police. Someone in the family reports the case. I have a certification from our prosecutors. They're prosecuting the case against the father for utilizing really extreme physical violence against the child. Young boy, 16. We start talking, we send him to therapy. He reveals during therapy that he's been out of school, working 3 jobs. This information now comes to us. Information goes to the prosecutor and the analysis starts. And of course, the father says, oh, he's lazy. We don't have enough in the house. He needs to contribute. Everything, all the stereotypes that we were talking about, they're reflected in this case. The child feels that he needs to shine for the father that has not been in his life for a long time. And so he feels proud of having 3 jobs. He does want to go to school, but he's really pleasing the father. So, you know, how do we work with the person that's saying, oh, I don't want my father to get into any more trouble. I don't want to lose contact with the family because all these other family members are blaming the child for telling the story, the full story. The fact that the father hit the child, well, how they were gonna, there was no priors for him. So he's gonna go to classes now, how to control the anger. Is that gonna resolve the issue? There's younger children in that home. And so this is actually what we have to face. We're working with the Department of Children and Family on mapping the case and staffing the case and saying, what do we do with this case? We work with the prosecutor, we work with the therapist. The child runs away. We call the police. It's and this is a 16-year-old male, which the issue of being undocumented also becomes very important in this because the father also has utilized that fact to manipulate the child and to tell stories and say and tell the child lies about his immigration status. We see this, I gave you the example with this case, but we had 3 young women from Mexico in a similar situation, 2 young women from Guatemala in a similar situation, these family reunifications that are happening. There's an exacerbation of these abuses because of COVID. And I think we need to mention for someone that is investigating these cases, the pandemic has really created an environment that is more dangerous. The tools utilized to instill fear are now enlarged. That we'd say the box of tools is more complete because you have COVID to really either keep someone completely isolated in fear of others or pretty much threaten that they cannot communicate with the outside because of what's happening. And so I think that that's just to make us think about how we approach a case, what time we give to the case for finding out what's happening with the case, what Lou was describing, the type of questions that we ask, how can we reach the full story without re-victimizing, or maybe buffering the re-victimization because sometimes we cannot escape it. And how do we deal with the community as a whole with this type of cases involve children that need to shine in order to not to embarrass the community, because that's the other element coming there. I am proud that my child is going to be a doctor. I am proud that my child has 3 jobs. Am I proud that my child, it's now, she got married at 16 and has now 2 kids. And so she has a home. And we're very proud of that because now she has a home and we forget about the age. But these are the communities that we encounter and we work with regularly in Florida.
So, Dr. Torres, the research that you've done in Texas, and I know that picking up some of these cultural issues around work might not be all that different between Texas and Florida. But I guess if you could maybe walk us through the tools that you've been working to develop to identify labor trafficking of children. I'd love to hear a little bit about that. I know that hopefully they'll get some funding across the transom as well, but I also know you well enough to know that you're not going to not work on it regardless of that. But can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are as to how people should be able to try to identify?
Yeah, so we have applied for funding for developing a rapid screening tool, mostly in healthcare and social service settings for child labor. What we've seen from a lot of the validated tools out there is that they're pretty focused on certain populations, mostly homeless youth, and also kind of like a higher, I think the highest or the lowest age they started as about 15. And we had applied for one where we go down to at least about, I think, 10 or 12 years old. And, take into consideration immigrant populations, homeless, the more at-risk groups. This, came to be from discussion from a lot of social service and healthcare providers in a group that we had, formed to say, in all the healthcare trainings, we just don't see discussion of, how to identify labor in these settings, and then most especially child labor. And then what does the law come into that? Because as Terry and Maria can speak better to it than I can, child labor laws are just a mess and all over the place. And then there's super huge gaps between the policies and which sector are you in and how old are you and are you enrolled in school and what's your status? And, I see the policies for sex trafficking. It's like, okay, well, that's always an illegal form of labor. So that's very clear cut. Now, when you talk about other forms of labor, especially if they aren't illicit, it's like, oh, well, then there's gray areas. And now we have to kind of figure that out, if they're protected or not. So in a study that we had done, a study I was a part of and looking at sex trafficking across the state of Texas, the focus was on sex trafficking, but I was still able, the research team and I were still able to include labor trafficking questions because we did want to see if there was any overlap or connection there. And then, the screening tool we used was really looking if they had any kind of exploitation, but of course they only passed the screening if, the exploitation was sexual. So there were several that we screened that did have some labor exploitation, but we didn't get them into the second interview. So then we got to see an overlap between sex and labor. And out of all of those who had screened positive as being a victim of child sex trafficking, I think it was something like 80 to 85% had some kind of labor abuse exploitation in the past. It was a really high percentage rate. I want to say it was almost at 90, had some kind of labor exploitation in the past. To us, it just, speaking to the kids, it just showed us it's the economic driver. If you're in need and need money, you're gonna, they were put in exploitative situations regardless of the sector, and they were across the board. And I think for labor, especially those that had been trafficked for sex, the highest or the sector that we saw the most was babysitting. And then that was another lesson for us, not in the 1 hour interview, I used the word traffic twice, and it was at the end of the interview. We asked when you were in this situation, did you ever go to a hospital? If they said yes, did anyone ever ask if you were trafficked? When you were in this situation, did you ever come across law enforcement? If they said yes, did they ask if you were trafficked? That's the only 2 times they used the word traffic. The rest of the time, It's like, what did you have to do for money? Or did you work? Or, did you have a side hustle? What was going on? How are you surviving? And they would always ask, like, well, I mean, what do you mean by work? Or what do you mean by job? Well, tell me what you meant by work, or what would you define as your job? And that's how we got a lot of discussions going. Now, that's to say that, yeah, we had several kids tell us, yeah, they babysat, but the more they talked about it, it wasn't an exploitative situation. But we had several that would say, I was staying at my aunt's, or I was staying at a friend's, and I had to watch their kids. And if I didn't, they wouldn't let me stay there. That was kind of like, I couldn't leave. I couldn't, whatever. I didn't get paid for it, but that I wouldn't have a place to stay if I wasn't doing this. And cleaning as well, all these situations where if you look at these situations, if I was told I wouldn't be able to eat or have a place to stay if I wasn't forced into having sex, it'd be a different conversation. Just the way we gender, I had boys telling me, I was in this relationship, this older woman, I, left home, and same thing with money. Yeah, this was cultural. The family was proud that this older woman had taken him into his home. They didn't have to, take care of him anymore. She was paying for everything. But if he didn't have sex with her, she let him know he was out in the street. I had someone in the research team ask me, is that really a trafficking situation? I said, what would you think if it was a girl? Just we gender these things, and then by sector, we moralize them, to kind of gauge, like, is this exploitation or not? And so it was interesting that babysitting was a big one. Yeah, you can stay here, but you're going to take care of my kids. You're going to be the one that's here watching them, and you can't go anywhere as long as the kids are in the house, and you're the one that has to be there watching them. So it really did come down to we had looked at 4 at-risk groups, those that had a past history in the juvenile justice system, those that had been at some point involved in systems, either CPS or foster care, history of running away, or really high rates of ACEs scores. And so, there was a lot of vulnerability for basic needs. And to look at the comparison of labor exploitation that they had faced, and the fact that at some point, either once or twice or chronologically, had faced some kind of sexual exploitation as well, commercial sexual exploitation as well. So, are we having these conversations with kids about that economic driver and about how poverty is actually impacting them and what they need for basic survival? And then how much of that survival from their family or their community falls on them, or if they're on their own. A lot of times being even a nuclear family doesn't mean that they're free of that, especially if the entire family, I'm thinking of some cases with seasonal migrant workers, the entire family is being exploited or abused to some degree, and the kid is a part of that. And that's just the understanding. This is something I have to do. I'm not in school right now. They can't leave me alone. There's no one else to take care of me. So I have to go with them and be working, on the situation as well. So yeah, I don't think there's a lot of those discussions, and honestly letting kids define what their experience is, and letting, both in the need, and if that's the need for money, if that's the need for someone to take care of them, if that's the need for a place to stay, whatever that need is, and as well as, like, what is work to you? How are you defining this? And does it mean survival? And is that survival contingent on someone else who's, exploiting you?
Yeah, these are tough concepts. I think especially when we're trying to differentiate, as the law always has to, between these circumstances, whether it's familial contribution versus something that then crosses the line. Just like there's difference between punishment and child abuse that has to be looked at. Terry, can you, knowing that we've got about 15 minutes left, and I think we've got 3 questions teed up, can you walk us through kind of the discussions that you and others have been having with the legislative branch on this? Because I would assume that in Florida, just like in most other states, there's kind of a residual attitude that kids need to work, and kind of the old farming mentality. And how do you differentiate labor trafficking of children from just that normal kind of chores and the expectations?
And Lou, that's been the dilemma, I think, not just here in Florida, but nationwide, that kids are allowed to work. There's, a whole Florida statute that says when they can. It depends on whether there's school going on, how many hours are they working, are there night hours involved? But one of the dilemmas that we really face in the legal world is that unlike sex trafficking of children, if children are engaged in commercial sex, by definition, they're victims. The same is not true for children engaged in labor. They have to show force, fraud, or coercion. And so many of the work situations they're involved with, or the exploitation situations, they don't rise to the level of force, fraud, or coercion. Oftentimes it's a relationship. It's a relationship that's being abused. It's somebody, the child that says, it's my tio, it's my uncle. Well, he's not really their uncle, not a biological uncle, but that they have a relationship in their mind with that trafficker, and getting them to work with that. And Maria Jose mentioned it too. For a lot of our younger children, especially foreign national kids, they're here to work. And they're from cultures where if you're 13 or 14, you are absolutely expected to work full time. This has been the dilemma with a number of the children, foreign national children that we've worked with, that not only do they not want to be rescued, the last thing they want to be is put in a group home where they can't work. One young man, our child welfare agency asked me, talk to him about the fact that he's drinking beer every night. He's 15 years old. And I talked to him, he says, I work 60 hours a week. What do you mean I can't drink beer at night? So that, our liquor laws were something that he was not buying what I was selling either. But these are children that see themselves as adults, and how they're exploited, oftentimes it's a relational situation. So we're trying to draft law here in Florida that would allow child trafficking to be looked at differently than the force, fraud, or coercion. Is there an abuse of a relationship? Actually, international law, the UN protocol, helps us when it comes to it. They have that concept. But that's one of the things. I got to also do a shout out to the state of Wisconsin. They have the one law that I know that deals with traveling sales crews, including children. And they have defined it. They've required certification and criminal background checks of all the people working as supervisor or owners. They're a great role model. We're looking closely at their statute as we consider not just child labor trafficking, but traveling sales crews in general.
Thanks, Terry. And I think one thing that I'll also tee up for everybody, and that I know that we've talked about in other webinars, is kind of that filial piety of wanting to contribute when your parents are involved with a particular religious organization. And we've seen a number of cases over the last couple of decades, actually, with children in labor trafficking situations that were not simply helping out at church, but were commercial activities. Most recently, this case, well, not most recently, but one of the recent cases up in North Carolina with kids that were working in a fish restaurant that was owned and operated by the church leaders. And so again, the impact of the parents, the impact of the family, and yet at the same time, the same type of beatings, isolation, threats, etc., that if it wasn't a parent or a family member, we would immediately be looking to human trafficking as what we think that it defines it. I think we're going to go to question and answers, and then at the end we might do a very quick speed round with our panel. But I understand that we've got some Q&As, and if Kevin, if you can put that up, and Amanda, were you going to read some questions for us, or do you want me to?
I am. All right, so the first question that you have is kind of two-part as it relates to law enforcement. First part is, what are you doing to change the perceptions of law enforcement? And what are things that law enforcement can do to be proactive in addressing labor trafficking?
Harry, would you like to try that?
Sure, trainings. What our group has been about really for 2 years. Can we get more trainings out there? And some of it is awareness about cultures. Some of it is awareness on where does labor trafficking hide in plain sight, but also looking at what are the particular vulnerabilities of our labor trafficking survivors. we need to get beyond the iconic victim, and we need to understand that much of our modern US economy lends itself to labor trafficking because of subcontracting that we talked about earlier. So it also, as it turns out, has a lot to do with law enforcement working closely with state agencies that regulate hours, that regulate, is an organization correctly paying workers' comp? Are they, it's financial crimes as well that are being committed against our workers, so that do our law enforcement officers work with their counterparts in the state agencies? It could be a Department of Financial Services, could be the Division of Business and Professional Regulation. Are they working with people that are in those agencies, which is where labor trafficking, because of the financial crimes that are involved, may also manifest?
Thanks, Terry.
Maria?
Yes, I wanted to add also that it would be very important to connect with community-based organizations to develop relationships if they haven't already, because those organizations, I'll give you an example, maybe the local domestic violence, not domestic violence, but because with that they already are connected, but with the domestic workers center, places where the workers go to find solace, to find respite, to find, to tell what's going on. And so that would be a place where you could, as law enforcement, come and do a presentation and explain what the laws are and how we can protect, and for the workers to know that they are protected from the mouth of law enforcement. And so that we've seen throughout the year that is very, very useful. If you are in a rural area, then connect with organizations that work with the workers, migrant farm workers or other agricultural workers. Same thing with organizations that work with people in construction. Any place where you see that the workers can find some protections, and then of course, you know, you develop a relationship with whoever is in charge, and make sure that you do it in a way that is not threatening to the individuals that come forward to that place. So we heard in the past that in some cases law enforcement would come without their uniforms. In others, they felt that it was necessary. Like the workers said, we feel better if the authority comes with their uniforms. I mean, you have to get to know the community and make sure that this is done in a manner that is not non-threatening.
I think the first step is always in any relationship, and of course I'm going to sound like a social worker here, but in any relationship where there isn't trust, the first step is to acknowledge that that trust has been broken, and not to come in and try to repair something like that, but owning the situation, saying, look, we know that there isn't trust, we know that there's this perception that's out there, what can we do to better that, and what position are we then in to build that relationship. I will say, working a lot with undocumented immigrants, I've heard stories of, the one time I was going to go to the emergency room, there was, a cop out there. It was a security guard, but it was someone who presented, as a police officer, might have had a gun or, a badge or whatever. And so they didn't go for help. Same thing for visiting certain centers. There was an organization, that had police outside for something and someone didn't enter. I've just heard these, when I did outreach at a shelter during a hurricane, someone had, FEMA is now under Homeland Security, so wearing the FEMA Homeland Security patch on their shirt made undocumented people not go to that shelter. It just, optics was really important. So, like Maria Jose said, work with those organizations to see what is a helpful way of building that trust and presenting. And I will say with youth in particular, the study that we had done in interviewing them, there wasn't, across the board, very, very little trust in law enforcement. But the ones that did was because they would name a particular officer to me and say, this guy or this woman, they would talk to me not when there was anything bad going on. They would see me on the street and bring me chips, ask me if I had a place to stay that night, or tell me that someone was going to come and arrest me if I was staying there. So helping me, taking me to ask me if I could go to a shelter, if they could drop me off somewhere else. They built up relationships, not as, waiting of getting information or some kind of bust was, getting information to help with something for an arrest. It was really building those relationships, and they were the ones that they trusted. They were the ones that they called the first time that something did go down, and that they were exploited. So relationship is really key, and working with them for how that relationship should be built.
So I think that ties us into a good intro for the next question, which is, what is the importance of partnerships with your federal U.S. attorney's offices or other federal law enforcement?
Maria Jose, you want to start us off on that one?
You're muted.
I would like to hear from you, Lou. First. Yes, we haven't heard from you much.
Well, I was on the other side of that. And so from, the perspective of federal law enforcement and working with, our victim witness coordinator from headquarters DOJ, but also in the U.S. Attorney's offices, I think this almost goes to Dr. Torres's point. If people know each other, you're much more likely, to reach out to federal law enforcement if that person is Alex Rivas from the FBI or Mike Barone from the Border Patrol, all the way back to those cases in the 1990s, because you're not thinking of them as everything you know about the organization. Some of things might be bad. Some of the things might have been hostile to your community or to your family, just because of circumstances. But instead, you think of that as that person. And I think that the U.S. Attorney's offices, especially, and the victim witness coordinators especially, play a very particular role in having that kind of longitudinal trust. One of the things that Maria Jose and I have been frustrated with over the years, and I've talked about, is the idea of rotations. When you get somebody who really knows what they're doing and is willing to act not like the stereotypical law enforcement person, but is willing to cede a little power to their NGO counterparts, is willing to be open to even responding to cues from people as far as, well, that person's not necessarily ready to be interviewed yet, and ceding the ability to direct your investigation on your time frame, and instead starting to understand the time frame of the victims and witnesses in your case. That ends up being invaluable because down the road you're going to end up having situations where things might have to be tested. You need to have that credibility in the bank. One of the things that we did on an early case involving sex trafficking in South Florida is a survivor from a labor trafficking case who had worked with the same case agents, actually came in, talked to the victims while they were still very traumatized, and basically said, I know these guys, and you can trust them. They helped me out. You should tell them your story. And it allowed them to make their decision as to whether or not they would end up talking to us. So I think that that's probably, to me, the biggest thing, whether you're asking that question on behalf of an outside entity or on the side of a federal entity. It's being open, being true partners. A couple more questions, which means I think we'll go just a snitch over time. I hope that you'll all extend and join us. For anybody else to actually leave at 3:30, we'll say goodbye. But we're not going to say goodbye. We're going to take those other questions as well.
All right, so the next question is, what does outreach to people outside of the human trafficking and labor trafficking community look like, and what do you find effective in communicating with those individuals?
Well, I want to see if Dr. Torres can start us off with that, because I think that in Texas, we've seen some pretty interesting attempts, both from the state and from some of the different more regional areas, as well as some of the non-governmental organizations. But what have you seen as the most effective outreach, Melissa?
I'm not sure I understand. Is this outreach from law enforcement or any kind of agency?
Outreach to, well, I think outreach from folks within the trafficking community to folks who are outside of the trafficking community.
Gotcha. I'm actually working on a plan right now for an organization that has so much to offer and is not being utilized by the populations that really should be utilizing it. I want to stress again, looking at, in public health, we talk about the social determinants of health. What are these intersections and these factors that are creating vulnerabilities or risks for certain diseases or certain health situations. And we, our group at the Global Mental Health Division has written papers and actually talks about the social determinants of human trafficking. What are those factors and how does that contribute to their health? What are things that we should be identifying? And that's an approach that I really brought to outreach also. And I think that that's one of the best practices I've seen from our group and others, the coalition that we're proud of and the Texas Medical Center and the organizations that are using it. And looking at, okay, we're not looking necessarily for those victims, right? Of course, you're going to have groups that do outreach specifically to like sex workers or, line up at a place where there's a lot of sex work or something, or in agricultural fields. But really, how can we do outreach in these hidden populations, in these vulnerable populations, and to start educating them about those risks? So, we've started outreaching to just here in Houston. There's the Mexican consulate that has a Ventanilla de Salud. They have the Ventanilla is like a window, but they have a space where different service organizations come to talk about their social services that they, that the community could qualify for. And so reaching out to them and saying, hey, did they know that, there's this organization over here that can talk to them about their labor rights, about their immigrant rights, about their rights as potential victims of violence or crimes. How can we then get that conversation going in a way that's generalized enough to know you might not be in this situation, but there might be this risk in your population. And I think that generalization is also an outreach tactic as well that we've been able to use, especially with vulnerable populations where someone's not going to jump up and be like, hey, I think that's me. I've been in that case. But they might come up to you and say, like, well, bueno, pues creo que mi vecina, I think my neighbor kind of mentioned this and she's in this situation, or, my husband works in the fields and he comes home and tells me about this or something. Another thing that we've done culturally is, and I'm a community health worker, and I really strive in focusing on community health workers because they can approach it not just in a trauma-informed way, but a culturally informed way in these discussions, especially when it comes to violence. Where it can be kind of like this generalized talk, but pinpointing it down to that understanding of, this does happen in our community and we know it. Maybe we name it another way, or maybe we see it another way. But, then we now know here are resource for it. And this is what you do qualify for, regardless if it tells you that you don't, or what you can access if you don't qualify for, federal assistance or in other ways. So I think working in the spaces where there are already people in the most vulnerable populations and just getting that general talk started and then focusing in on, okay, now that we know what the situation is, here are the resources if these situations do happen.
Okay, are you ready for your last question? How can agencies prepare for potential victims such as refugees coming in from Afghanistan and other countries?
Harry, I might want to see if, since you've, with the task force approach that you've been working on, I think you've done kind of pre-planning and thinking about how to have that kind of resilience through those task force models. Can you start us off?
Yeah, it's both our task forces, but I think also, as Maria Jose mentioned, it's who are the people on those task forces, and especially our non-governmental service providers. And that could be the International Rescue Committee. It could be local church groups. I mean, there are going to be a host of stakeholders in those task forces, and that trafficking will be one of the things that's on their radar screen. But many of them will be immigration advocates. Many of them will have other toolkits that they can actually bring to the table, so that in general, you're going to have some pretty skilled professionals, and professionals whose portfolios are fairly widespread. So, I mean, that's a good thought. If I understand it correctly, I mean, what do those of us who are anti-trafficking advocates, what do we see might be applicable to refugee populations, if that's the question, Lou?
Yeah, I think that's, you know, how do we get ready in the trafficking world? But also, how do we then allow ourselves to be open to the needs of the broader refugee community? And, you know, it seems to me like those two communities are, the Venn diagram is pretty overlapping in because of, you know, how and where we ended up looking to the early anti-trafficking responses was very much looking to the refugee service providing organizations, whether it was the LIRRS, the Lutherans, whether it was the Catholics, you know, the voluntary agencies, the VOLAGs, that work in the refugee resettlement communities. You know, a lot of those early years, kind of 2000 to 2005 or so, a lot of those early cases and the early service provision was going through the refugee things, because they were already existing. If you think about the international institutes, some of which have changed their names, International Institute of Connecticut has now changed its name to, I think, Connecticut Immigrant and Refugee Center, and they do almost, you know, the bulk of the counter trafficking service provisions there. Well, you know, those international institutes date from 1919. They were dealing with the refugee crisis of Belgium and of the First World War, and so we've got people with 100 years worth of experience. I guess that's one of the things then, is to make sure that they know the kind of specialized knowledge that the counter trafficking community has, and folks who might not have relationships with the refugee service providers. This is a good time now to reach out and start to get those relationships. Maria Jose, I think that the work that you and a lot of folks in South Florida have done flows out of refugee work historically, right?
Yes, and I think that there throughout the years, this the mainstream, we can call the mainstream refugee resettlement agencies have been the first ones to open to learn about human trafficking. And so when Terry described our connection back in 2002, 2003, is because we were working with the International Rescue Committee in providing access to benefits, to public benefits, to the survivors of the Cadena case. And that was the time where they got the first T visa. And so the social service providers at the time was a refugee resettlement agency. Now, can we say that they were ready to provide services to women and young girls that were forced into the sex industry? Probably not. But through the years, we got to the point that we were ready, and we continue the relationship with them, and they're amazing. And I'm just mentioning IRC, but there's many others. And then I think that with the new influx of refugees, specifically from Afghanistan, but remember that we have had several years in our recent past where no refugees were coming in. And now we are opening the doors again. And so it's not only refugees from Afghanistan, because from Afghanistan, they've been coming more regularly than from other places because of the situation, because of the ongoing war. But this is an everyday problem. It's not that something new because they come all of a sudden from Afghanistan. So this is something that we face all the time. We work together. They have to be part of these task forces, education, training. And again, all the cultural aspects from the communities that are coming over, we have to really face them and talk about it with them, because the family that is going to be relocated and integrated in United States society will receive information about the laws, what's permitted, what's not. And again, there's no full proof that we are not going to see domestic violence, that we're not going to see sexual violence, that we're not going to see human trafficking. We will, like in any other context, but we are ready to do some kind of prevention with those individuals that are coming in.
Yeah, at the end of the day, this group of humans is a group of humans, and they're going to have all of the good and bad things that any group of humans ends up having with them. Amanda, I want to check in and see if we have any more questions teed up.
Nope, that is all of the questions that came in from the chat box.
All righty, well then, why don't we do just a very quick, kind of maybe a 1-minute speed round, so we can leave on a high note, because sometimes this can be a little depressing when we talk about all of the challenges and everything that we've seen out there. And the question that I have for each of you, and I think Dr. Torres, if we can start with you, what keeps you in the game? You know, a lot of people do maybe one case or they do one study and then they go work on something else other than trafficking and slavery. What has kept you working on this, and more importantly, what inspires you to keep going?
Is that me?
We're going to start with Melissa,
Oh,
and then we'll go to Maria Jose after.
What keeps me going is everyone I work with. And honestly, yeah, I think the more I learn, the more questions I have. You know, I guess that's being a researcher, but you know, the more you learn, I came into the trafficking world, you know, hearing that this is the best response and this is how you solve it and this is how, you know, it happens. And I initially believed a lot of, I'll call it rhetoric. And then the more I actually saw exploitation, learned about exploitation and with different populations and some of the most marginalized. And I think that is a blessing in disguise that I entered this through one of the most marginalized populations that's overlooked even today. And I started seeing how there is no one answer to this. There is no one solution, and there is no one way that exploitation happens. So I don't think it's an easy fix of ending it, and it'll be a continuous question of how do we just not exploit other people and be okay with that, especially, you know, for profit, and not focus on someone's need for survival. So as long as we can help someone survive and thrive, you know, out of these situations and reduce as much harm as we can, you know, that's what keeps me going.
Excellent. Maria Jose, same question. What keeps you in the game and what inspires you to keep going?
I have this that I received recently. It said, thank you. And it says, Maria and Vida's team, the words are not sufficient to express my gratitude towards you in this moment. After all these years of waiting and uncertainty, she just received her lawful permanent residence. Finally, we can celebrate this great news. Maria, we have something pending to celebrate. I'm translating from Spanish. God bless you and multiply immensely everything you do with love and admiration. So this is just to segue on what Melissa was saying. This is one person, one family. That's why we're here. We will continue. My goal now is to find the next generation of lawyers that would like to do this. I think I'm getting closer to maybe retirement. But yes, I'm gonna be a grandma soon. I want to be home with my child, my grandchild. But you know, mentor other attorneys, young attorneys, with the energy, with the creativity, with the desire and commitment to help others. I think this is what really keeps me going. And maybe I will have to wait another 10 years to find the next generation. But thank you all for being patient and being here with us.
Excellent. Terry, can you take us out?
Well, maybe similar to both Maria Jose and Melissa. And I guess it's the question of why are you in the human rights field? And it's because of the amazing resiliency of human beings that we get to be a part of helping people rebuild their lives after horrific things, after torture or sex trafficking, domestic violence, terrible things that happen, but we get to see people rebuild their lives. And I feel bad sometimes for my friends who are prosecutors or law enforcement. They'll work with that survivor victim maybe for 9 to 12 months, but only for as long as the case goes on. And you don't get to go to the weddings or the baptisms or to see people rebuild their lives. And that's the great privilege of being in the field from where we are. We see terrible things every day, but we also get to see human resiliency. And that keeps me in the game.
Well, and I will use the moderator's privilege to end up as well. And one of the things that inspires me to keep going and keeps me in is having the opportunity to be able to be with such amazing leaders in the field like Maria Jose Fletcher, Terry Coonan, and Dr. Torres. And so I want to thank another organization that inspires me, and that's the COPS office and IRR for the great work that you're doing on this webinar series. And the great work that hopefully comes out of this as people come to the table and get out there and start making those relationships and start bringing some justice to the world. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists today. And thank you to everybody that stayed on and participated in the Q&A. We hope that you found this presentation helpful. If you have any questions after we conclude, we have a contact slide up on the screen with contact information should you have any questions for our panelists today. Thank you, everyone.